Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was the reincarnation of the first one for all user. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world was a symphony of roaring chaos that had, in an instant, been reduced to a single, deafening note of pain. Izuku Midoriya wasn't sure when the cheering had stopped. He remembered the blinding flash of ice and fire, the concussive force that had lifted him from his feet, and the gut-wrenching finality of landing just outside the ring. Now, sound was a distant, muffled thing, like listening to a festival from the bottom of a swimming pool. The primary reality was the screaming chorus of his own nerve endings. His left arm was a ruin, a grotesque landscape of purple and black, with fingers bent at angles that defied the very concept of a hand. His right leg felt like a bag of shattered glass. He tasted blood and concrete dust. Medic team! To the ring, now! President Nick's usually boisterous voice was strained, cutting through the fog with a sharp edge of urgency. Faces swam above him. Vague shapes with worried eyes. He thought he recognized Cementos' blocky silhouette, his expression uncharacteristically grim. Someone was talking to him, but the words were slippery, refusing to hold their shape. All he could latch onto was the sensation of being carefully, yet agonizingly, lifted onto a stretcher. The slightest movement sent fresh waves of agony crashing through him. His body, which he had so willingly offered up as a sacrifice for a single, desperate chance to reach Todoroki, was now betraying him in 1,000 different ways. As they carried him down the tunnel, the roar of the crowd finally began to filter back in, a vast, inhuman sound. They were cheering for Todoroki, for his immense power, for the spectacle. And they should, Izuku thought through a haze of pain. Todoroki had won. He had used his fire. A small, fractured part of Izuku's mind clung to that fact like a piece of driftwood in a storm. He had lost the battle, but maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost the war for his friend's heart. The thought was little comfort as the infirmary doors hissed open and the sterile, sharp scent of antiseptic flooded his senses, momentarily overpowering the metallic tang of his own blood. Recovery Girl was a tiny storm of focused efficiency. Her lips were pressed into a thin, disapproving line as her gaze swept over his mangled limbs. Good heavens, boy! She tooted, her voice a familiar mix of exasperation and genuine concern. All might spoils you, and this is the result. You treat your own body like it's a disposable resource. One of these days, my quirk won't be enough. He wanted to apologize, to explain that it was the only way, but his jaw was a knot of pain and his tongue felt thick and useless. He could only watch as she leaned forward, her oversized syringe cane forgotten for a moment. She gently took his uninjured hand, her skin soft and wrinkled. All right, Izuku. This is going to be unpleasant. I have to set the bones before I can heal them. Brace yourself. He didn't have time to. With a series of sickening crunches and pops that seemed to echo inside his skull, the medical robots beside her began their work, manipulating his shattered limbs. A scream tore from his throat, raw and broken. It was a sound of pure, animal pain, stripped of thought or pride. Through the black spots blooming in his vision, he saw Recovery Girl's lips touch his forehead. The familiar, gentle warmth of her quirk washed over him. It was a draining sensation, a profound weariness that pulled at him from the inside out, sapping his stamina in exchange for mending his flesh. The sharp edges of agony began to dull, melting away into a vast, throbbing ache. The world softened. The harsh lights of the infirmary blurred into a gentle glow. His consciousness, already frayed, began to unravel completely. He was falling, not in the physical sense. It was a slow, spiraling descent into a sea of gray static. The lingering sounds of the infirmary, the beep of a monitor, Recovery Girl's soft humming, dissolved into a low, featureless hum. It was the sound of nothing, the visual equivalent of a television tuned to a dead channel. This was the space between, the void his mind fell into when his body gave out. He was used to it, in a way. It was the price of using one for all at 100%. But this time, the static felt different. It was heavier. Colder. Usually, this mental space was empty, a temporary oblivion before waking. Now it felt occupied. There was a pressure here, a presence lurking just beyond the veil of the gray haze. A feeling of profound and ancient claustrophobia began to creep in, wrapping around his submerged consciousness like a shroud. The formless void started to take on a shape, not a visual one, but a sensory one. It was a box, small, dark, cold. The air grew thin, stale. He could feel the oppressive closeness of walls, though he could see nothing. The air tasted of dust and recycled air, and beneath it, a strange, metallic tang that was nothing like the blood in his mouth. It was the scent of cold, unforgiving steel and something else, something sharp and sterile, like the infirmary, but devoid of any healing intent. It was the smell of a cage, panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the exhaustion. This wasn't his body's panic from the fight. This was something else. A primal terror that didn't belong to him. It was a fear born of absolute helplessness, of long, silent hours spent in crushing confinement. He tried to move, to push against the encroaching walls, but the limbs he commanded were not his own. They were weak, frail, unresponsive. They felt wrong, unfamiliar. His own body was safe on a cot in Ye. He knew that. He had to know that. This was a dream. A nightmare brought on by the pain and the healing. A fever dream. It's not real. It's not real. He chanted the words in the silent space of his mind, a desperate mantra against the encroaching dread. But the feelings were too potent, too real. The suffocating darkness, the chillingly low temperature that seemed to seep into his very soul. The phantom sensation of cold metal against his back. Then came the voice. It didn't boom or shout. It whispered, slithering through the static like a serpent. It was a man's voice, deep and resonant, yet smooth as polished glass. There was an undercurrent of amusement to it, a casual cruelty dressed in the fine robes of affection. It was a voice that held immeasurable power, yet chose to speak with the intimacy of a shared secret. And it was chillingly, terrifyingly familiar. Not to Izuku Midoriya, the student, but to some deeper, older part of him that was now screaming in silent terror. Don't be foolish, little brother. The words were not just heard, they were felt. They landed in the core of his being like a physical blow, a calculated injection of poison. They carried a weight of history, 1,000 prior conversations just like this one. They were the words of a jailer to his prisoner, a god to his creation, a predator to his beloved prey. The phantom box, the stale air, the suffocating dread, it all snapped into focus around that single, horrific phrase. Little brother. Izuku Midoriya was an only child. The contradiction was so stark, so absolute, that it shattered the nightmare. He was thrown back into himself with the force of a physical impact. He woke with a strangled gasp, lurching upright on the infirmary cot. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic, desperate rhythm. Cold sweat plastered his hair to his forehead. His eyes, wide with a terror he couldn't name, darted around the room, frantically taking in the reassuringly mundane details. The white walls, the neatly organized medical supplies, the gentle afternoon light filtering through the blinds. He was safe. He was in Recovery Girl's office. His left arm was in a heavy cast, his fingers visible and thankfully straight. His right leg was similarly immobilized. The agony was gone, replaced by the profound, bone-deep exhaustion he knew so well. He was safe. So why did he still feel the phantom chill of the vault? Why did the smell of antiseptic now seem layered with the ghost of cold steel? Easy there, dearie. Recovery Girl's voice cut through his panic. She was sitting at her desk, peering at him over her spectacles. You gave yourself quite a scare. A bad dream, I imagine. Not surprising, given the trauma your body has been through. A bad dream. Yes. That's what it was. What else could it be? Why, yeah. He stammered, his voice hoarse. Just a nightmare. He tried to force a reassuring smile, but it felt like a grimace. He could feel the lie sticking in his throat. A nightmare was formless, chaotic. This had been structured. It had rules. It had a history. The voice, calm and possessive. The title, Little Brother. It felt less like a dream and more like a memory. But it wasn't his memory. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, trying to rub away the afterimage of the oppressive darkness. He focused on the facts. He was Izuku Midoriya. His mother was Inko Midoriya. He was an only child. He lived in Musudafu. He went to UA High. He was the 9th inheritor of One for All. These were the pillars of his reality. He clung to them, using them to rebuild the walls of his own identity against the terrifying echo of that other existence. But a crack had formed in the foundation. A whisper of static now buzzed at the edge of his hearing, a chilling reminder of the voice from the dark. He spent the next hour in a state of quiet, anxious turmoil. Recovery girl fussed over him, checking his vitals and giving him a juice box, chiding him all the while about self-preservation. He nodded and mumbled apologies, but his mind was elsewhere, circling the drain of that experience. He tried to analyze it, to break it down like he would a hero's quirk. Data point 1, claustrophobia. Extreme, unnatural. Source, unknown. Data point 2, sensory input. Cold, darkness, metallic scent. Consistent with a sealed, sterile environment. A vault or panic room? Data point 3, the voice. Male, deep, calm. Tone, possessive, condescending. Intimate. Data point 4, the words. Don't be foolish, little brother. Implies a familiar relationship that does not exist in my life. The analysis was useless. It provided no answers, only deeper, more unsettling questions. Where did it come from? Was it a side effect of One for All? Had he somehow glimpsed something from one of the past users? But All Might had never mentioned anything like this. He'd spoken of the vestiges as faint echoes, a feeling of strength, not full sensory nightmares with speaking roles. Could he be losing his mind? Was the pressure of being All Might's successor finally breaking him? The thought sent a fresh jolt of fear through him, colder than any phantom vault. If he couldn't trust his own mind, he was useless. He would fail All Might. He would fail everyone. No. It was a one-time thing. A fluke. A hallucination born of extreme pain, exhaustion, and the use of a healing quirk. It had to be. He would forget it. He would push it down and focus on what was real. He was just starting to convince himself when the door to the infirmary opened. The figure standing in the doorway seemed to block out all the light, a giant of a man even in his most withered state. The familiar V-shaped bangs, the deeply sunken eyes that still held an indomitable fire. It was All Might. He was in his civilian form, his oversized shirt hanging loosely on his skeletal frame, but his presence still filled the room with an almost tangible aura of power and hope. "Young Midoriya," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He offered a small, tired smile, but his eyes were filled with a profound, aching pride. "All Might!" Izuku exclaimed, his own worries momentarily forgotten in the presence of his mentor. He tried to sit up straighter, a reflexive act of respect. Recovery girl shot All Might a look. "Don't you go getting him all worked up, Tashinori. He needs to rest. And you need to have a serious talk with him about the meaning of the word moderation. Of course, Chio. I will be brief," All Might promised, pulling a chair up to Izuku's bedside. He waited until Recovery Girl turned back to her paperwork before speaking again, his voice softer. "I watched your match, my boy. Every second of it." Izuku's gaze dropped to the crisp white blanket covering his legs. A flush of shame crept up his neck. "I'm sorry, All Might. I lost. And I broke myself again. I couldn't control it, Izuku," All Might said, and the seriousness in his tone made Izuku look up. The hero's eyes were shining with an unspeakable emotion. "What you did out there, it was more than I could have ever asked for. You didn't just fight a battle, you reached out and saved a soul who was drowning. Young Todoroki," he used his left side. "Because of you." He reached out and placed a bony hand on Izuku's shoulder. The touch was grounding, a familiar anchor in the turbulent sea of his thoughts. "A hero's duty is not just to win fights," All Might continued, his voice thick with conviction. "It is to inspire hope. To save people not just from villains, but from their own darkness. Today you did that. You acted like a true hero. I am so proud of you." The words were a balm on his raw, aching soul. Tears pricked at the corners of Izuku's eyes, hot and sudden. All Might's approval was the sun that his entire world orbited around. To hear that praise, after feeling like such a failure, was overwhelming, and in that moment of raw emotion, of complete trust between mentor and student, the urge to confess was overpowering. The secret of the nightmare felt like a physical weight on his chest, and he wanted nothing more than to share the burden. Tell him. Tell him what you saw. He'll understand. He knows about One for All. Maybe he can explain it. All Might, he began, his voice trembling slightly. When I was unconscious, something strange happened. All Might leaned in, his expression shifting to one of deep concern. What is it, my boy? Did you feel something from One for All? Here it was. The moment of truth. Izuku opened his mouth to describe the cold, the dark, the suffocating pressure. To repeat the words that echoed in the hollow spaces of his mind. Don't be foolish, little brother. And he stopped. A wave of self-doubt crashed over him, swift and merciless. What would All Might think? He was already a walking skeleton, carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He was entrusting his sacred power, his very legacy, to a boy who couldn't even get through a tournament without breaking himself to pieces. What would he think if that same boy came to him babbling about scary voices and phantom prisons? He would think he was unstable. He would worry that the power was too much for him, that his mind was cracking under the strain. He might even regret his choice. The thought was unbearable. A blade of ice in his gut. Izuku couldn't do that to him. He couldn't add another worry to All Might's already impossible burden. This was his problem. A strange, terrifying, secret problem, but his and his alone. He would handle it. It was just a dream, after all. He was being childish. He forced another smile, this one even more brittle than the first. It was nothing, really. I think I just felt the vestiges. The past users. Just for a second. Like a rush of power. It startled me, that's all. It was a plausible lie. Close enough to the truth to be believable, far enough to hide the horrifying core of the experience. All Might's concern softened into a knowing look. Ah. Yes, that can happen. As your body and the quirk become more synchronized, you may feel their presence more strongly. It is a sign of your growth, young Midoriya. They are accepting you. They are with you. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The presence he had felt was not accepting. It was suffocating. It was not with him. It was imprisoning him. You have a long road ahead, All Might said, his smile returning, though it seemed tinged with the melancholy that always clung to him now. You will learn to control this power. You will become a greater hero than I ever was. Rest now. Heal. Your journey is just beginning. He gave Izuku's shoulder a final, firm squeeze before standing up. With a nod to Recovery Girl, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Izuku alone once more. The warmth of his presence faded, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void felt different now. It was heavier. It was colder. Izuku stared at the closed door, the hero's praise echoing in his ears alongside the ghost of that other, sinister voice. He had made his choice. He would carry this alone. He would push it down, bury it under layers of training, studying, and the relentless pursuit of his dream. He would pretend it never happened. But as he lay his head back on the pillow and closed his eyes, the gray static in his mind was no longer empty. In the vast, silent expanse of his consciousness, a single, discordant whisper lingered, a promise of darkness yet to come. The seed of the past had been planted. And in the fertile, traumatized ground of Izuku Midoriya's soul, it was beginning to take root. The whisper was gone, for now, but the static remained. The 2 weeks following the UA Sports Festival were a blur of healing, quiet contemplation, and a persistent, low-grade anxiety that clung to Izuku like a second skin. The memory of the voice, the phantom sensation of the vault, had not returned with such terrifying clarity, but its echo remained. It was a whisper in the static at the edge of his thoughts, a sudden chill in a warm room, a fleeting sense of being watched when he was utterly alone. He'd buried it under a mountain of furious note-taking and punishing physical therapy, convincing himself it was a one-time anomaly. An aberration. But the fear lingered, a tiny, cold stone in the pit of his stomach. Now, that anxiety was being given a new name, Gran Torino. The bullet train rocketed towards Hosu City, the scenery outside a verdant, streaking blur. Beside him, the diminutive old hero was fast asleep, his head lolling to one side, a thin line of drool tracing its way towards the collar of his mustard-yellow costume. To the other passengers, he looked like a harmless senior citizen enjoying a nap. Izuku knew better. He had the bruises to prove it. His internship had been a brutal, chaotic trial by fire. Gran Torino's method of teaching was less instruction and more controlled demolition. He'd forced Izuku to break down one for all, to stop seeing it as a special move and start seeing it as a part of himself. The result was full cowl, a technique that felt like a revolution. For the first time, he could use his power without shattering his own bones. He could move like a hero, feel like a hero. Yet, even in the midst of this breakthrough, the shadow lingered. During one particularly grueling training session in Gran Torino's debris-strewn apartment, Izuku had been backed into a cluttered closet. For a single, heart-stopping second, the enclosed space, the darkness, and the pressure of the old hero's assault had triggered a flash of that same suffocating claustrophobia from his dream. He'd frozen, his breath catching in his throat, his mind screaming about walls closing in. Gran Torino had capitalized on the hesitation, sending him flying with a jet-propelled kick to the ribs. "Your mind is wandering, kid!" the old man had barked, landing deftly on a pile of pizza boxes. "You hesitate like that in a real fight, you're dead. What's spooking you?" Scared of the dark? Izuku had mumbled an excuse about being off balance, the lie tasting like ash. He couldn't explain that for a moment. He hadn't been in a messy apartment in Dagoba Municipal Beach. He'd been back in the cold, silent box, with a whisper of a voice just at the edge of his hearing. Now, as the train's automated voice announced their approach to Hosu, the memory of that training mishap mingled with the news reports that had been cycling all morning. Hosu City was on edge. Several pro-heroes had been attacked, their bodies found paralyzed and wounded but alive. The work of the hero killer, Stain. A shiver traced its way down Izuku's spine that had nothing to do with Gran Torino. The name itself felt profane, a bloody slash across the bright tapestry of Heroes Society. Izuku had pages of notes on him, analyses of his presumed quirk, his ideology, his victims. He was a monster, but a monster with a purpose, which somehow made him even more terrifying. Suddenly, the train lurched violently, screeching to an emergency halt that threw sleeping passengers from their seats. Gran Torino was awake in an instant, his drowsy demeanor vanishing to reveal the razor-sharp focus of a veteran pro. "What was that?" Izuku asked, his own heart instantly hammering. Before anyone could answer, the side of their train car imploded. Metal shrieked and glass exploded inwards. A pro-hero Izuku vaguely recognized as some kind of rabbit-themed hero flew through the newly made hole, slamming into the opposite wall with a sickening crunch. He was followed by a grotesque creature, a hulking beast with an exposed brain and dead, glassy eyes. A Nomu. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the car as civilians scrambled away from the monster. The Nomu's head swiveled, its empty gaze landing on the terrified passengers. "Stay back!" Izuku yelled, instinctively moving to stand between the creature and the civilians. "I'll handle this. You get the injured hero and the civilians clear!" Gran Torino commanded, his body already buzzing with energy. Before Izuku could even protest, the old hero shot forward, a yellow blur ricocheting off the walls and ceiling, his jet-propelled kicks slamming into the Nomu with the force of small explosions. Izuku's training took over. He scooped up the injured pro, his full call humming to life, green sparks crackling around him as he carried the man towards the back of the car, yelling for people to follow him. The stress was immense, a crushing weight of responsibility. The screams, the smell of burning metal, the sight of the unnatural, twitching Nomu. It was a maelstrom of sensory input. And through it all, a single, horrifying thought: this is real. This isn't training. People can die. Just as he got the last civilian out of the immediate danger zone, his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, but a strange premonition made him glance at the screen. It was a location pin. A single, cryptic message from Ida. Izuku's blood ran cold. He knew that location. It was a dark, narrow alleyway, far from the main thoroughfares. A place you wouldn't go unless you were looking for trouble, or if you were looking for someone specific. He remembered Ida's grim expression after the sports festival, the cold fire in his eyes when he spoke of his brother, Ingenium. who had been one of Stain's first high-profile victims in Hosu. No. Ida, you idiot! He looked back at the fight. Gran Torino was holding his own, but another Nomu had appeared outside, wreaking havoc on the street below. The city was under attack. It was a coordinated assault. Gran Torino! He yelled over the din. Ida, my friend, I think he's in trouble. He's going after the hero killer. Gran Torino slammed a kick into the Noma's head, sending it staggering. Don't be a fool, boy. Your duty is here. Stick with the mission. The old hero was right. The logical, professional thing to do was to stay, to help contain the immediate threat. But the image of Ida, so consumed by grief and rage, facing that monster alone, was a chemical fire in his gut. The raw, desperate need to save his friend, to pull him back from the brink, overruled everything else. It felt primal. It felt familiar. The ache of wanting to protect someone and being unable to. I'm sorry! Izuku shouted, and then he was moving. He burst out of the ruptured train car, landing on the elevated track. The city below was a scene from a nightmare. Fires burned unchecked, smoke plumed into the night sky, and the distant screams were a constant, harrowing chorus. Another Nomu, this one with leathery wings, was terrorizing a crowd in the plaza below. No time. He had to trust the other pros to handle it. With a surge of power, he launched himself from the tracks, soaring through the air. Full cowl wrapped around him like a second skin, the green lightning a stark contrast against the orange glow of the fires. He landed on a rooftop, his legs absorbing the impact, and then he was running, leaping across gaps between buildings with a speed and grace that was still new to him. The wind whipped past his face, a cool balm against the heat of his rising panic. He was pushing himself, faster and faster, his mind locked on Ida's location pin, a tiny beacon in a city descending into hell. He found the alley just as his worst fears predicted. The scene was a macabre tableau bathed in pale moonlight. The pro-hero native was slumped against a dumpster, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. Ida was on the ground, his armor pierced, his body rigid and unmoving. And standing over them, silhouetted against the alley's entrance, was the man himself. Hero killer Stain. He was exactly as menacing as the news report suggested, and infinitely more so. Taller than Izuku had imagined, lean and corded with muscle. His patchwork costume of black leather and red rags made him look like a nightmarish scavenger. His face was a mask of frenzied intensity, dominated by a long, blood-red scarf and eyes that burned with a terrifying, fanatical light. The air was thick with the coppery stench of blood and a palpable aura of murderous intent. Another false hero comes to the slaughter. Stain rasped, his voice like scraping stones. He licked a long, unsettling tongue across the blade of a katana, a drop of Ida's blood clinging to the tip. This society, filled with fakes and posers who chase fame and fortune, they must all be purged. You! Ida choked out from the ground, his face a mask of fury and shame. You're the one who hurt my brother! I will kill you! You are the weakest of them all! Stain sneered, raising his blade. Driven by personal vengeance. You are the furthest thing from a true hero. There was no time for a plan. No time for analysis. Only action. Ida! Izuku roared, his voice cracking with desperation. He poured every ounce of power he could safely contain into his legs, launching himself down the length of the alley. Smash! He didn't aim for Stain. He aimed for the wall beside him, unleashing a 5% Detroit smash. The punch was a feint, a distraction. The resulting shockwave of displaced air was meant to push Stain off balance, to give him a precious second to grab Ida and Native and get out. But Stain was faster. He moved with a fluid, inhuman grace, sidestepping the blast as if it were a gentle breeze. He turned, his burning eyes locking onto Izuku. A child, he hissed. Playing dress-up. Izuku landed, skidding to a halt between Stain and his friends. I won't let you kill them! The fight was a blur of motion. Izuku was faster than he'd ever been, his full cowl allowing him to weave and dodge, but Stain was on another level. He was a seasoned killer, his movements ruthlessly efficient. Every swing of his katana, every slash of his smaller knives, was precise and deadly. Izuku was on the defensive, his mind racing, trying to analyze, to find an opening. He saw one. After a wide swing of the katana, Stain's right side was momentarily exposed. Izuku pivoted, channeling more power into his arm for a direct strike. It was a risk, but he had to take it. It was a trap. Stain had anticipated it. As Izuku lunged, the hero killer dropped low, a smaller, serrated blade appearing in his left hand as if from nowhere. Izuku tried to pull back, but it was too late. The blade whipped out, not aiming for a vital point, but for his arm. A line of fire erupted along his bicep. It wasn't a deep cut, barely more than a scratch, but the pain was sharp, immediate. And with the pain came a sudden, sickening lurch. The world went silent. The grimy alley, the smell of blood, the desperate face of Ida. It all dissolved into a haze of gray static, just like in the infirmary. But this time, the descent was faster, more violent. He was ripped out of his own body, torn from his own time. The static cleared. He was no longer Izuku Midoriya, hero in training. He was in a different body, a weaker one. He was sitting on a simple cot in a small, sparsely furnished room. It was clean, but felt temporary, like a safe house. Sunlight, bright and hopeful, streamed through a single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He looked down at his hands. They were pale and slender, the hands of someone not used to physical labor. His own calloused, scarred fingers were gone. A wave of vertigo washed over him. A man was sitting across from him, cleaning a rifle with practiced ease. He had a shock of stark white hair that fell across his forehead and kind, determined eyes that held a flicker of weariness. He looked up and smiled, a genuine, warm expression that seemed to chase the shadows from the room. "Don't look so worried, Yoichi," the man said, his voice gentle. "We're safe here. He won't find us this time, Yoichi." The name echoed in the hollow space of his consciousness. It felt right. It felt like his own name. He, Yoichi, opened his mouth to reply, but before a sound could escape, the door to the room creaked open. Another man stood in the doorway, and the sunlight seemed to warp around him, refusing to touch his form. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a simple, dark suit. His hair was a pristine, almost luminous white, much like the other man's, but that's where the similarity ended. His face was a mask of handsome, charismatic perfection. He was smiling, a wide, friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes, a piercing, ruby red, held no warmth at all. They held only an endless, chilling depth. It was a predator's gaze, assessing, owning everything it saw. It was the face of the man from his nightmare. The owner of the voice. "There you are," the man said, his voice the same smooth, resonant tone from the vault. It was laced with a feigned disappointment, the sound of a parent who has caught their child breaking a minor rule. "I was so worried. You shouldn't run off like that, little brother. The world is such a dangerous place." The white-haired man with the rifle, Kaido, his mind supplied, the name bubbling up from a deep well of affection and trust, was on his feet in an instant, leveling the weapon. "Stay back, you monster!" Kaido snarled, his kindness replaced by a fierce, protective snarl. The smiling man simply chuckled, a low, pleasant sound that was the most terrifying thing Yoichi had ever heard. "Monster? Kaido, my friend, I am a savior. I bring order to a world of chaos, and I have come to take my brother home. He's not your property, isn't he?" The man took a step into the room, his smile widening. He paid the rifle no mind at all. "I gave him everything. I protect him. I love him. He is mine." His red eyes flickered to Yoichi, and for a second, the charming facade cracked, revealing a chasm of raw, terrifying possessiveness. "And I don't like it when people try to take what is mine." It happened faster than a blink. The man raised a hand. Black and red tendrils, like solidified lightning, erupted from his fingertips, snaking across the room. Kaido fired the rifle, the sound deafening in the small space, but the tendrils simply engulfed the bullet, absorbing its kinetic energy without effort. They wrapped around Kaido's body, lifting him from the floor. He struggled, his face contorting in pain as the energy crackled around him. Yoichi screamed. Or he tried to. No sound came out. He was frozen on the cot, a statue of pure terror. This was a familiar feeling. The feeling of utter, complete, soul-crushing helplessness. You see, little brother? The man said, his voice still infuriatingly calm as he watched Kaido choke. This is what happens when you associate with lesser beings. They are fragile. They break. Only I am strong enough to keep you safe. With a casual flick of his wrist, the tendrils tightened. There was a sickening, wet crunch. Kaido's body went limp, his kind eyes now wide and vacant. The tendrils retracted, and his lifeless form crumpled to the floorboards in a heap. The smiling man turned back to Yoichi, his expression unchanged. He looked at the corpse of his brother's only friend, then back at his brother, and his smile somehow grew more radiant. "Now," he said, extending a hand. "Shall we go home?" The grief was a physical force, a tidal wave that crashed over Yoichi, drowning him. It was a pain far worse than any physical blow. It was the agony of loss, compounded by the bitter poison of his own impotence. He hadn't been able to do anything. He couldn't fight. He couldn't save him. He couldn't even scream, "My fault. My fault. My fault." The words were a silent, desperate mantra of self-loathing. The memory dissolved. Izuku came back to himself with a gut-wrenching gasp. He was on his hands and knees on the filthy asphalt of the alley. The pain in his arm was a dull throb, but it was nothing compared to the phantom agony clawing at his heart. His cheek was pressed against the cold, gritty ground. Stain was standing over him, his blade raised for a final, paralyzing lick. "You have the eyes of a true hero," the killer mused, almost conversationally. "But you are still just a child. It is a pity I must end you here." But Izuku wasn't just Izuku anymore. The grief from the memory, Yoichi's grief, was still fresh, a raw, open wound in his soul. But beneath it, something else had been unearthed. The impotent rage that had been chained down by fear and frailty for a lifetime was now surging through a body that could finally handle it. A body charged with one for all, the helplessness he had just experienced fused with every moment of helplessness in his own life. Being bullied by Bakugo. Being told he couldn't be a hero. Watching his friends in danger. The 2 lifetimes of frustration, of rage, of a desperate need to protect, merged into a single, incandescent point of fury. He didn't think. He reacted. With a roar that was more animal than human, Izuku slammed his fist into the ground. It wasn't a smash. It was a raw, unfocused burst of power. The asphalt cracked and splintered under the blow. The explosion of force was just enough to make Stain take a half step back, his eyes widening in surprise. That was all the opening Izuku needed. He surged to his feet, his movements no longer the calculated hops of full cowl. They were frantic, ferocious, almost clumsy, but charged with a terrifying energy. He wasn't fighting like a hero in training trying to capture a villain. He was fighting like a cornered animal trying to tear its aggressor limb from limb. He screamed, a wordless cry of pure, undiluted rage, and threw himself at Stain. His fist connected with Stain's jaw. The killer's head snapped back, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. For a split second, Izuku saw not the blood-soaked fanatic, but the ghost of a smiling, charismatic man with red eyes. The rage intensified. The fight became a whirlwind of green lightning and gleaming steel. Izuku was taking hits, small cuts opening up on his arms and legs, but he barely felt them. He was fueled by an ancient fury that burned hotter than any pain. He was no longer just protecting Ida and Native. He was fighting for the ghost of a white-haired man named Kaido. He was fighting for Yoichi. He was fighting to undo a lifetime of being a prisoner. "What is this fire?" Stain snarled, parrying a wild punch. "This is not the desperate energy of a child. This is something older." Just as Izuku was about to be overwhelmed by his own reckless assault, a wall of ice erupted at the end of the alley, followed by a torrent of fire. "Midoriya!" Todoroki's voice cut through his rage-filled haze. He skidded to a stop, turning to see his friend, his face grimly determined, standing with one side steaming and the other frosted over. "I got your message," Todoroki said, his eyes scanning the scene. "Looks like you need a hand." The battle raged on, now a 3-on-1 fight. With Todoroki's help, they were able to push Stain back, to create space, to finally fight with strategy instead of just raw emotion. But even as he coordinated with Todoroki, Izuku's mind was a battlefield. The memory replayed itself on a loop behind his eyes, Kaido's kind smile, the black and red tendrils, the casual cruelty of the man with the red eyes, the crushing weight of Yoichi's grief. When they finally subdued Stain, tying him up with the aid of a now-recovered Ida, the adrenaline began to fade. And as it receded, the horror rushed in to take its place. He stood there, his body trembling uncontrollably. It wasn't from the cold of Todoroki's ice or the lingering exhaustion of full cowl. It was a deep, bone-rattling tremor that started in his soul. He looked at Ida alive. He looked at Todoroki alive. He saw the pro-hero native being tended to by paramedics who had just arrived. They were all safe, but the ghost of Kaido lay dead on the floor of his memory. He stumbled back against the alley wall, sliding down to a sitting position. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. "Midoriya? Are you okay?" Todoroki asked, his usual stoicism replaced by a flicker of genuine concern. "You're shaking." "I'm fine," Izuku managed to say, but the words were hollow. He wasn't fine. He was fundamentally, irrevocably altered. A door in his mind had been kicked open, and he could never close it again. Later, in the pristine, white room of the Hosu General Hospital, the truth finally coalesced. Lying in the sterile bed, the smell of antiseptic a haunting echo of the vault, and the killer's sterile metal, he pieced it together. The whisper in the static. "Don't be foolish, little brother," the face from the memory. The handsome, charming man with the soul of a tyrant. The murderer of his friend. His brother. They were the same person. The realization hit him not with the force of a punch, but with the terrifying, silent certainty of gravity. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a fever-induced hallucination. It was a memory. A real one. And it wasn't his. Or rather, it was his, but from a life he wasn't supposed to remember. He, Izuku Midoriya, was somehow Yoichi Shigaraki, the first user of One for All. And his ancient enemy, the man who had tormented him, imprisoned him, and murdered his friend, was his own brother. All for One. The name, once just a legend, a symbol of ultimate evil that All Might had defeated, was now a personal wound. It was the name of his jailer. The name of a murderer who had smiled while doing it. The name of the man who called him brother. The cold stone of anxiety in his gut had become a block of ice. The crack in his reality had become a gaping chasm. He had been wrong to keep this from All Might. So terribly, dangerously wrong. This wasn't a burden he could carry alone. This wasn't just his secret anymore. It was the secret of One for All itself. It was a dark, twisted history that was apparently still playing out, with him and his friends caught in the middle of it. He looked at his casted arm, the place where Stain's blade had sliced his skin and torn open his past. It was a small wound, but it had changed everything. Lying there in the quiet of the hospital room, Izuku Midoriya made a vow. The fear of sounding crazy, of being a burden, was nothing compared to the terror of the truth he now held. He had to tell All Might. He had to tell him everything. The Hosu General Hospital was a bastion of sterile white and hushed efficiency, a stark contrast to the burning, chaotic city it served. For 2 days, Izuku had been confined to its quiet rooms, his body mending under the watchful eyes of nurses and the occasional, brief visit from a grim-faced police detective. His official story, the one carefully constructed by the chief of police, was that he and his friends had been caught up in the chaos and defended themselves. The truth, that they had defied the law to confront and defeat the hero killer, was a secret buried under layers of official reports. But Izuku was harboring a secret far deeper and more terrifying than unsanctioned vigilantism. He lay in the crisp, starchy sheets, staring at the acoustic tile ceiling. The world outside his window was returning to normal. News reports hailed the capture of Stain and the defeat of the Nomu, praising Endeavor for his pivotal role. His friends, Ida and Todoroki, were recovering in rooms down the hall. They had visited earlier, their conversation a strange mix of relief, shared trauma, and a new, unspoken bond forged in the bloody crucible of that alley. Ida, humbled and deeply grateful, had apologized for his reckless pursuit of vengeance. Todoroki, ever the stoic observer, had simply sat with them, his presence a quiet pillar of support. Izuku had smiled, said all the right things, but he felt a million miles away. He was an island, separated from them by a sea of memories that were not his own. Every time he closed his eyes he saw it, the sunlit room. Kaido's kind face twisting in agony. The casual, smiling cruelty of the man with the red eyes. The black and red tendrils of power, so horrifyingly similar to the black whip that had recently begun to stir within One for All. And the name. Yoichi. It felt as much a part of him now as Izuku. The grief was the worst part. It wasn't an abstract sadness, it was a visceral, personal wound. A hollow ache in his chest for a friend he, Izuku Midoriya, had never met, but whose death he, Yoichi Shigaraki, had witnessed. The rage was a close second, a simmering magma of hatred for the man who had called him brother. The fear of being crazy had evaporated, replaced by the terrifying certainty that he was not. This was real. This was the hidden history of his quirk, and it was alive inside him. The decision he made in the alley, to tell All Might, had solidified from a desperate impulse into a leaden weight in his stomach. He was no longer just going to share a strange dream. He was going to unearth a century-old grave and force his mentor to look at the corpse within. He was discharged on the third day, his arms still in a sling, a collection of smaller bandages adorning his limbs like grim trophies. A sleek black car, courtesy of Yue, was waiting to take him back to the school. He'd expected a staff member he barely knew, but the figure that stepped out of the driver's seat made his breath catch. It was All Might, in his skeletal form, looking more tired and fragile than Izuku had ever seen him. The skin was stretched tight over his sharp cheekbones, and the shadows under his eyes were deep, dark pools of exhaustion. "Young Midoriya," he said, his voice a low rasp. He managed a weak smile. "I thought I'd come get you myself. It's good to see you on your feet, All Might." "You didn't have to." Izuku started, flustered. "Nonsense, my boy. After what you went through, it's the least I can do." He opened the passenger door, his movements careful and deliberate. The ride back to UA was heavy with unspoken words. All Might asked about his recovery, and Izuku gave rote answers. The usual easy rapport between them was gone, replaced by a tense silence. Izuku stared out the window, watching the cityscape slide by, his mind rehearsing the words he needed to say, each version sounding more insane than the last. All Might seemed to sense his turmoil, his gaze frequently flicking from the road to Izuku's pale, serious face. The hero's brow was furrowed with concern, mistaking Izuku's profound existential dread for simple post-traumatic stress. They didn't go to the dorms or the main faculty office. All Might led him through a series of quiet, restricted access corridors to a part of the school Izuku had never seen. The final door was heavy, soundproofed wood. It opened into a small, private meeting room. There was a single, large table of dark, polished mahogany, several comfortable chairs, and no windows. The lighting was soft, the air still and silent. It was a room for secrets. "Please sit," All Might said, gesturing to a chair. He sank into the one opposite, letting out a weary sigh. He folded his bony hands on the table, his deep-set eyes fixing on Izuku. "I've read the official police report, young Midoriya. And I spoke with Grand Torino. I know what really happened in that alley. You, young Ida, and young Todoroki, you did a heroic thing, a reckless, dangerous, law-breaking thing," he added, a hint of the mentor's sternness in his voice, "but heroic nonetheless. You're safe now. You can talk to me. What's weighing on you so heavily?" Here it was. The point of no return. Izuku's hands, resting in his lap, began to tremble. He clenched them into fists, his knuckles turning white. He took a deep breath, the sterile air of the room feeling thin and inadequate. "All Might," he began, his voice barely a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing himself to meet his mentor's gaze. "It's more than what happened with Stain. It's about One for All. Something happened during the fight. Something, unlocked." All Might leaned forward, his concern deepening. "The vestiges again? Did you feel their power?" "No. Not like before." Izuku shook his head, his eyes dropping to the polished surface of the table, where his reflection was a distorted, pale mask. "It wasn't a feeling. It was a memory. A whole memory. It felt more real than this room." A heavy silence settled between them. All Might waited, his patience a tangible presence. He knew this was important. He could see the raw, unadulterated fear in his successor's eyes. Izuku began to speak, the words tumbling out in a rushed, quiet torrent. He described the moment Stain's blade cut his arm, the sickening lurch as he was torn from his own consciousness. He described the sunlit room, the cot, the unfamiliar, frail body he was inhabiting. "There was a man with me," Izuku said, his voice shaking as he dredged up the image. "He had white hair, a kind face. He was cleaning a rifle. He called me Yoichi." All Might's posture, already tense, went ramrod straight. The name hung in the air between them, shimmering with a terrible, ancient significance. It was a name All Might knew only as a whisper, a legend passed down from Nana Shimura, the name of the beginning. "Yoichi," All Might repeated, his voice strained. "Go on, my boy." Izuku took another shuddering breath, his own memories of the event blurring with the vividness of the one he was recounting. He felt a phantom grief prickling at his eyes. Then, another man came into the room. A different man. He was smiling. He looked charming. But his eyes... All Might, his eyes were red, and when I saw him, I felt a terror so complete, it was like my soul recognized him. He described the man's voice, smooth as glass and just as cold. He repeated the words that were seared into his brain. "There you are, little brother. I was so worried." At the word brother, a sharp, audible hiss of breath escaped All Might's lips. His face, already pale, seemed to drain of all remaining color. He looked as if he'd been physically struck. Izuku pressed on, needing to get it all out before his courage failed him. He described the black and red tendrils of energy, the casual, horrific murder of the man named Kaido, the smiling monster's complete lack of remorse. "He killed him right in front of me," Izuku choked out, the phantom grief welling up and threatening to overwhelm him. Tears he hadn't shed in the hospital now tracked down his cheeks, and all I could do was watch. I felt so helpless, so weak. It was a pain worse than any broken bone. And then he turned to me, to Yoichi, and he smiled. And he said, "Shall we go home?" When Izuku finished, the silence in the room was absolute, profound. It felt as if all the air had been sucked out. He finally risked a glance at his mentor. Tashinori Yagi was staring at him, but his gaze was distant, unfocused. His face was a canvas of shock, horror, and a dawning, terrible understanding. His hands, resting on the table, were trembling far more violently than Izuku's had been. This was not the reaction of a man listening to a strange dream. This was the reaction of a man staring into the face of a ghost. "The voice," All Might finally whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "When you were in the infirmary after the sports festival, you said you had a nightmare. Was it him?" Izuku's blood ran cold. He had tried to bury that, to forget it. He nodded numbly. He was in my head. In a dark place. A small, cold box. He called me little brother then, too." All Might slammed a fist on the table, a sudden, shocking explosion of sound in the quiet room. The table shuddered. It wasn't a gesture of anger at Izuku, but of pure, unadulterated fury at an unseen enemy. "That monster!" he snarled, the words dripping with a venom Izuku had never heard from him before. "Even from the depths of Tartarus, his evil reaches out." He looked at Izuku, his eyes blazing with a fire that was part protective and part terrified. "Young Midoriya." "Izuku, do you understand what you are telling me?" "I think so," Izuku said, his voice small. "The first user of One for All, his name was Yoichi. And his brother was All for One." All Might sank back into his chair, the fire in his eyes banking into smoldering embers of sorrow. He looked impossibly old. "Nana, my master, she told me the stories. The legends passed from user to user. That One for All was born from an act of defiance between two brothers. She spoke of the first user, Yoichi, as a man with a fierce will for justice but a frail body. She never knew the details. No one did. They were lost to time. Just echoes. Feelings." He paused, his gaze intensifying. But she did say one thing. She said the vestiges always felt incomplete. Like a missing piece. A foundation that was present but silent. He stared at Izuku, and his mind was a whirlwind. The boy's impossible dream, the detailed memory, the names, the description of the powers, it was all too specific, too perfect to be a coincidence. He remembered his own time as the holder, the vague feelings he'd get from the vestiges within. A sense of longing from Nana, a grim determination from the sixth, but from the first, nothing, just a faint, steady pulse. A quiet hum of existence, as if the spirit wasn't just an echo, but was waiting, biding its time. The pieces clicked into place in his mind with the terrifying finality of a prison door slamming shut. "It's not just a memory, is it?" All Might asked, his voice low and heavy with the weight of his conclusion. "This isn't just a new facet of the quirk. You aren't just seeing Yoichi's past. You are Yoichi." Izuka flinched at the bald statement, but couldn't deny it. I don't know. I feel like myself. But I feel like him, too. His grief, his rage, it feels like mine." "Reincarnation." All Might breathed, the word sounding like a blasphemy. "We've seen quirks that can manipulate memories, even souls. But this, to be reborn, the soul of the first user returning in the ninth. It's unheard of. A 1 in a trillion chance. Or perhaps..." His eyes widened slightly. Perhaps it was inevitable. The quirk, seeking its own origin. A cycle closing as the final battle approaches. He looked at the boy before him. This child, who he had chosen for his heroic heart and selfless spirit. He had thought he was giving him a terrible burden, the duty to fight a symbol of evil. He hadn't realized he was returning a soul to its own personal, eternal war. "You are not just my student," All Might said, the realization settling over him like a funeral shroud. "You are a living historical document. You are the genesis of this entire struggle." The pride he felt for his successor was still there, but it was now laced with a profound, aching pity. The weight on this boy's shoulders was not just the future of the world. It was the unbearable weight of a past he should never have had to remember. The emotional intensity of the confession, the raw validation from All Might, acted as another key in the lock of Izuka's mind. As he sat there, trying to process the concept of his own reincarnation, the sterile, quiet room around him began to feel colder. He blinked, and for a fraction of a second, the polished mahogany table was replaced by a small, metal tray. Another memory bleed. This one was different. It wasn't violent or tragic. It was quiet, insidious, and somehow, even more horrifying. He was back in the vault. The oppressive darkness, the recycled air, the chilling cold. He, as Yoichi, was sitting on a thin pallet on the floor. He was weaker here, thinner. The memory was from a later time, after months, or maybe even years, of this confinement. Hope had withered into a numb, desperate ache. A section of the wall slid open with a near-silent hiss, flooding the small space with a soft, warm light. His brother, All for One, stepped inside. He was holding a gleaming silver tray, upon which sat a lavish meal, roasted meat, steaming bread, fresh fruit, a crystal goblet of what looked like wine. It was a king's feast. All for One knelt down, placing the tray gently in front of Yoichi. His smile was soft, filled with what the world would mistake for love. "You've been refusing to eat again, little brother," he said, his voice a gentle chide. "You mustn't do that. You're so fragile. You'll waste away." Yoichi didn't look at him. He stared at the wall, his expression blank, his will eroded to almost nothing. "Why?" Yoichi's voice was a dry, rasping whisper, frail from disuse. "Why keep me here?" All for One reached out, his hand cool and smooth as he brushed a stray strand of white hair from Yoichi's forehead. The touch was meant to be comforting, but it felt like the caress of a spider. "Because I love you," he said, his sincerity a terrifying performance. "You saw what the world outside is like. It's cruel. It's ugly. People like Kaido, they pretend to be your friend, but all they do is put you in harm's way. They want to use your conviction for their own petty wars. They don't understand your value. They would see you broken or worse." He gestured around the small, featureless vault. "Here? You are safe. Here no one can hurt you. No one can manipulate you. There is no pain, no struggle. Only me. Only my protection." He picked up a piece of the roasted meat with a small fork, holding it up to Yoichi's lips. I bring you the best food. I give you books to read. I keep you safe from all the horrors of the world. All I ask is that you stay here. With me. Where you belong. The memory clarified a horrifying, fundamental truth for Izuku. This wasn't just imprisonment. This was a twisted, obsessive act of love. All for one hadn't locked his brother away out of simple cruelty, or to neutralize a threat. He had caged him because he genuinely believed he was protecting him. He saw Yoichi not as a person, but as a precious, fragile object that belonged to him, something to be kept pristine and untouched by the outside world. He had systematically eliminated every one of Yoichi's connections, not just as threats to his empire, but as rivals for his brother's affection and loyalty. His love was a cage, built from obsession and gilded with manipulative care. Izuku gasped, snapping back to the meeting room. His heart was pounding. He looked at All Might, his eyes wide with this new, more intimate horror. He thought he was protecting me. Izuku stammered, recounting the new memory fragment. He told me he loved me. He locked me away to keep me safe from the world. To keep me all to himself. If All Might's face had been pale before, it was now ashen, the color of old bone. The murder of Kaido was an act of a monster solidifying power. This was something else. This was the intimate evil of a twisted soul, a glimpse into the foundational psychology of the greatest villain the world had ever known. His obsession with control, with ownership, it didn't start with quirks. It started here. With his brother. My God! All Might whispered, leaning his elbows on the table and burying his face in his hands. He was silent for a long moment, his whole body trembling. When he finally looked up, the weight of a century of conflict was etched onto his features. All this time, I fought him as a symbol. A force of nature. A cataclysm of evil, but I never truly understood the man. I never knew the shape of his darkness. He looked at Izuku, and his expression was one of profound, soul-deep sorrow. The burden I gave you, it is so much heavier than I ever knew. I am so sorry, my boy, it's not your fault. Izuku said, the words automatic, but he felt their truth. This was a story that had started long before All Might was even born. The dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. The invisible line between mentor and student had dissolved. They were no longer just a teacher and his successor. They were two soldiers, staring at the same ancient enemy, one from the end of the war, and one from its very beginning. Izuku was no longer just a child to be protected. He was a key, a witness, a ghost returned to the battlefield. And All Might was no longer just a guide. He was the weary keeper of a legacy that had just revealed its own tragic, beating heart. We have to be careful, All Might said, his voice regaining a sliver of its command. If your soul has returned, it stands to reason that All for One would be able to sense it, on some level. The connection between you, between the quirks, it's stronger and more dangerous than we ever imagined. The way you reacted in the alley, the rage you felt, that was Yoichi's rage, given an outlet for the first time. It makes you powerful, but it could also make you reckless. He will try to use that against you. Izuku nodded, understanding completely. The fury he'd felt towards Stain had been a terrifying, intoxicating force. It was a weapon, but one without a safety. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, the immensity of the revelation settling around them. The soundproofed room felt like its own kind of vault, a temporary sanctuary where they could confront this impossible truth. Izuku felt strangely calm. The terror was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was no longer a solitary terror. He had told his secret, and the world hadn't ended. His mentor hadn't called him crazy. He had believed him. The weight was no longer his alone. It was theirs, and it was the weight of 2 lifetimes. The days following his confession to All Might were strangely subdued. The earth-shattering revelation that he was the reincarnation of the first one for all user didn't manifest as a sudden, dramatic change in his daily life. There were no more spontaneous, violent memory bleeds. Instead, the knowledge settled deep within him, a constant, humming undercurrent beneath the familiar rhythm of school, friends, and recovery. He returned to Class 1A, where he was greeted with a wave of relief and concern. Uraraka's worried questions, Ida's formal gratitude, even Bakugo's grudging. You're not dead then? All served as anchors to his current reality, to his life as Izuku Midoriya. He clung to these interactions, to the simple normality of worrying about upcoming exams and planning study sessions. They were a shield against the echoing silence of the vault, and the ghost of a grief that was not entirely his own. But the shield was translucent. He would be in the middle of a conversation with his friends and a phrase or a gesture would brush against the edges of a buried memory. He'd see Todoroki's dual-colored hair and feel a phantom pang of loss for another white-haired companion. He would hear Present Mix's enthusiastic shouting and a cold dread would coil in his gut, a leftover instinct from a life where loud noises drew unwanted, terrifying attention. He and All Might met in secret, in the same windowless room where the truth had first come to light. Their conversations were no longer simple training debriefs. They were now the cautious, exploratory dialogues of two historians trying to piece together a fragmented, living manuscript. Izuku would recount the sensory details of his memories, the metallic tang of the air in the vault, the texture of the rough blanket on the cot, the chillingly pleasant cadence of his brother's voice, and All Might would listen with rapt, grim attention, absorbing every detail as if it were a crucial piece of battlefield intelligence. "It's not enough," All Might said one afternoon, his voice heavy with frustration. He paced the small room, his skeletal frame casting a long, dancing shadow. "These fragments, these traumatic echoes, they give us glimpses into his cruelty, but they don't give us a strategy. All for One is a master manipulator with over a century of experience. To fight him, to understand the threat he now poses through young Tamura Shigaraki, we need more. We need context. We need to know how he built his empire, how he thinks, how he controlled people. The answers must be inside One for All." Izuku nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. "The other vestiges. You said they were like echoes. When I was unconscious after the festival, I felt them. Like a crowd in another room." "Exactly," All Might affirmed. "For me, they were faint presences. Feelings. For Nana, they were whispers. For each generation, the connection has grown stronger as the quirk stockpiled not just power, but will. For you, you're not just the ninth holder. You're the first returned. The foundation. If anyone can communicate with them directly, it's you." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. To consciously step into that other realm, the strange, hazy space he'd only ever glimpsed in moments of extreme physical distress. To meet the ghosts who lived inside him. What would they be like? Would they resent him for the danger he was in? Would they blame Yoichi for starting this whole mess? "How?" Izuku asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do I do it?" "Meditation," All Might answered, though he looked uncertain. "That's what Nana told me she tried. To quiet the mind, to focus inward on the core of the power, and to reach. It is uncharted territory, my boy. It could be draining. It could even be dangerous. We don't know what consciously connecting with 7 other souls will do to your psyche." The warning hung in the air, heavy with risk. But the alternative, to wait for the next traumatic event to trigger another memory fragment, was far worse. He needed to be proactive. He needed to take control of this power, of this past, before it took control of him. "I have to try," Izuku said, his voice firm with a resolve that surprised even himself. Their first attempts were clumsy and frustrating. They used a quiet training room, one of the empty dojos in Gym Gamma. Izuku would sit cross-legged on a mat, just as All Might instructed, and try to quiet his mind. But his mind was a hornet's nest of anxiety. Thoughts of his mother, his friends, his grades, the looming threat of Shigaraki, and the ever-present specter of All for One swarmed him. He would focus on his breathing, on the thrum of One for All under his skin, but the connection remained elusive. He would feel a flicker of warmth, a brief spike of energy, and then nothing. After a week of failures, Izuku was disheartened. "It's no use, All Might. I can't clear my head enough. Every time I get close, I just end up thinking about everything I'm afraid of." All Might looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps that's the problem, young Midoriya. You're trying to push the fear away. You're treating meditation like a chore, a means to an end. But this isn't about silencing your thoughts. It's about accepting them. One for All is not just power, it's emotion. It's the culmination of 8 lifetimes of hope, struggle, and yes, fear. Don't fight it. Sink into it. Let the quirk be your anchor. The advice was esoteric, but something in it resonated with Izuku. The next day, he tried again. He sat on the mat, closed his eyes, and instead of trying to empty his mind, he focused on the very core of his power. He let the anxiety wash over him, picturing it not as an obstacle, but as part of the current. He envisioned the crackling green energy of full cowl, not as something he was wearing, but as his own blood, his own life force. He followed that energy inward, deeper and deeper, past the frantic beating of his own heart, past the noise of his conscious mind. He was searching for the source. For the original spark. He was searching for Yoichi, and then, he found it. The world dissolved. Not into the violent, tearing static of his memory bleeds, but into a soft, gentle fade. The dojo, All Might's concerned presence, the feeling of the mat beneath him, it all receded, replaced by a vast, misty expanse. He was standing in a shifting gray fog. It wasn't the cold, oppressive static from before. This place was neutral. A blank canvas. Motes of colored light, like fireflies, drifted aimlessly through the mist. Faint flickers of emerald green, a deep, smoky black, a soft, ethereal blue. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding strangely clear in the silent space. As he spoke, the fog began to coalesce. Figures started to take shape around him, emerging from the mist like statues being unveiled. They were translucent at first, shimmering phantoms, but they slowly gained substance, color, and form. There were 7 of them. To his right stood a tall, bald man with a serious, almost severe expression, clad in a dark, high-collared coat. Goggles were pushed up onto his forehead. This was Hikid Shinomori, the 4th user, whose danger sense had just begun to awaken in Izuku. He felt a faint, prickly sensation from him, a sense of constant, weary vigilance. Near him was a man with a wild mane of dark hair and a confident, almost cocky smirk. He wore a simple V-neck shirt and had a distinctive scar over his right eye. Lariat, the 5th user, Daigoro Banjo. From him, Izuku felt a surge of boisterous energy, and a phantom ache in his arms, the dormant power of Black Whip. There was another man, lean and clad in a hero costume that seemed practical and worn, his face half obscured by a scarf. And, the 6th user. The air around him felt thick, heavy with the smell of smoke, and Izuku felt a faint, choking sensation in his own throat, the legacy of smokescreen. He saw the others too. The 2nd and 3rd, their faces less clear, their forms more like sketches than finished portraits. Their history was more deeply buried, their identities lost even to All Might's memory. They stood together, a silent, imposing duo, their presence radiating a grim, hardened resolve. And then he saw her. She stood slightly apart from the men, her presence a beacon of warmth in the gray expanse. She wore her hero costume, the familiar dark, sleeveless bodysuit and pale cape. Her dark hair was tied back, and a single beauty mark graced her cheek. But it was her eyes that held him. They were dark, kind, and filled with a profound, almost overwhelming sorrow, yet they shone with an unbreakable strength. Nana Shimura. All Might's master. The 7th user. She looked at him, and a sad, gentle smile touched her lips. "So," she said, her voice a soft, melodic sound that seemed to resonate directly in his soul. "The little one finally decided to knock." Izuku stared, utterly speechless. They were real. They were here. Not just feelings or echoes, but sentient consciousnesses, preserved within the heart of the quirk. You can see me? You can talk?" he stammered, feeling like a child who had stumbled into a meeting of gods. Daigoro Banjo, the 5th user, let out a booming laugh that seemed to momentarily part the mists. "Kid, we've been watching you stumble around in there since the day Toshinori stuffed this thing in you. It's like having a front row seat to the world's clumsiest acrobat. Break my arms. Break my legs. Painful to watch, I tell ya. Daigoro, be nice." Nana chided gently, though the corner of her mouth twitched in amusement. She turned her full attention back to Izuku. Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of deep, solemn understanding. "We always felt you were different, 9th. More at home here than any of us. The others, they were guests in this house. You built the foundation." The confirmation sent a shiver down Izuku's spine. "Then you know." About me. About Yoichi. A silence fell over the assembled ghosts. The air grew heavy. Heikage Shinomori, the fourth, spoke for the first time, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. We did not know the specifics. The first was always silent. A presence without a voice. We felt his will, his defiance, but not his memories. We assumed they were lost, buried too deep under the weight of generations. It seems the quirk decided it was time for them to be found. Nana added, her gaze filled with a new intensity. Your experiences in the physical world, your direct confrontations with the echoes of his evil, the hero killer, the Nomu, they acted as a key. You didn't just inherit the power, you inherited the trauma. And it seems that trauma is the bridge between your two lives. Izuku's mind reeled. So it wasn't just the quirk reaching a new level of power. It was his own life, his own struggles, that were dredging up the past. His fight to be a hero was literally unearthing the life of the first hero. I saw him, Izuku said, the words catching in his throat. He looked at them, at this council of ghosts, his true predecessors. I saw all for one. Not the monster in the mask that fought All Might, the man he was. My brother. He recounted the memory of Kaido's death, his voice shaking. As he spoke, he felt their reactions not just in their expressions, but as waves of emotion washing over him through the quirk. He felt Daigoro's boisterous energy curdle into cold fury. He felt the constant vigilance from Heikage sharpen into murderous intent, and from Nana, he felt a wave of profound, soul-crushing sorrow that mirrored his own. Her grandson, Tenko, was now the vessel for this ancient evil. She was linked to this tragedy on a level he could only begin to imagine. When he finished, it was Nana who spoke, her voice laced with steel. This changes everything. We have fought All for One for a century. We treated him as a force of nature, a plague upon the world, but you have seen the source of his rot. His obsession, his possessiveness, it is the key to his psychology. He doesn't just want to conquer the world. He wants to own it, just as he wanted to own his brother. He's a collector, Heikage added, his arms crossed over his chest. His gaze was sharp, analytical. He sees people, quirks, everything, as objects to be acquired and stored. His brother was merely his first and most prized possession. That is his weakness. His sentimentality. His obsession with the past. And that obsession is now focused on you, kid, Daigoro said, pointing a translucent finger at Izuku. And on the Shimura kid. He's trying to recreate his family, but twisted. A puppet brother in Shigaraki, and the real thing returned in you. It's some sick, twisted play he's putting on. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that was more terrible and more coherent than Izuku could have imagined. His personal memories weren't just a tragic backstory, they were a tactical advantage. So the memories, Izuku began, looking at the spectral figures around him. Are they all going to be this painful? A heavy silence descended once more. Nana Shimura's expression was one of deep pity. The quirk of One for All was not born in a moment of triumph, child. It was born in a prison. It was forged in defiance against a beloved, monstrous brother. It stockpiled not just power, but a century of grief, loss, and sacrifice. The memories you are unlocking, they are the foundation of that sacrifice. They hold the key to understanding his evil, but yes, they will come at a great mental cost. You will feel every loss as if it were your own. She took a step closer, her form flickering slightly. She reached out a hand, not to his shoulder, but as if to touch his heart. The path ahead of you will be lonely. You will carry knowledge that you cannot share with your friends, your classmates. You will see the face of your brother in your enemy. It is a burden no child should have to bear. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. A lonely path. He was already feeling it. The distance between him and his friends, the secrets he had to keep from Uraraka and Ida. He was on an island, and he had just met the 6 other inhabitants. But you are not alone, she continued, and her voice was a fierce, burning flame. Not anymore. We are more than just echoes now. Through you, through the first, our wills are connected. We are a council. We are your council. We will guide you. We will lend you our strength. Daigoro's black whip, Heikage's danger sense, They are awakening because your soul is ready to accept them, to understand them on a fundamental level. The silent second and third users took a step forward in unison. Though their faces were indistinct, Izuku felt a wave of pure, unyielding resolve from them. They had fought all for one at the height of his power, in the dark ages of quirks. They had died for this cause. Their presence was a silent vow. "We stand with you first," one of them seemed to say, the words forming directly in Izuku's mind. To the very end, the weight of their combined will, their history, their sacrifice, filled the misty space. It was immense, crushing, but it was also supportive. He wasn't just Izuku Midoriya, the scared, overwhelmed ninth user. He was the vessel for 8 generations of heroism. He was the focal point of a century-long war. He was Yoichi Shigaraki, and this time, he wasn't frail and alone in a vault. He had an army inside him. The realization was empowering, a surge of strength that pushed back against the ever-present fear. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice filled with a new sense of purpose. "You train," Daigoro boomed. "You get a handle on my black whip before you accidentally tie up your entire class. You listen to Four Eyes over there." He jabbed a thumb at Hikage. "And learn to trust that tingle in your skull when danger's near. You master the tools we gave you, and you live," Nana added softly, her expression softening. "You live your life as Izuku Midoriya. You cherish your friends. You learn. You grow. Yoichi's life was stolen from him. Do not let his past steal your present. That is the greatest victory you can have over him. Be the hero Yoichi never had the chance to be." Her words were the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. He didn't have to choose between being Izuku and being Yoichi. He could be both. He could use Yoichi's knowledge and pain to fuel Izuku's heroic drive. He could honor the past by building a better future. He felt a gentle pull, a sensation like waking from a deep sleep. The misty realm was beginning to thin, the figures of the vestiges fading back into shimmering light. "It's time to go," Nana said, her voice a gentle echo. "All Might is worried. But know this, Izuku Midoriya. We are here now. We are listening. We are with you. You only need to reach for us." The world of gray dissolved, and he was back in the dojo with a gasp. He was sitting on the mat, his body drenched in a cold sweat. His head was pounding, and a profound exhaustion settled into his bones. It felt as if he'd just run a marathon. "Young Midoriya! Are you all right?" All Might was kneeling in front of him, his face etched with deep concern. He'd been about to shake Izuku awake. Izuku looked up at his mentor, his vision still slightly blurry. He managed a weak, but genuine smile. "I'm all right, All Might," he said, his voice hoarse. "More than all right." He took a deep breath, the air of the dojo feeling solid and real after the ethereal mist. "I met them. All of them. And they spoke to me." He watched as a storm of emotions crossed All Might's face, shock, awe, relief, and an overwhelming, tearful pride. The weary keeper of the flame was finally seeing the embers glow with a light he had only ever dreamed of. Izuku knew the road ahead was terrifying. It was paved with more pain, more loss, and more horrifying secrets. But as he looked at the hopeful face of his mentor, he felt the silent, resolute presence of the 6 other souls within him, and the faint, foundational hum of his own past life. For the first time since that whisper in the static, he didn't feel like a victim of his past. He felt like its master. He was no longer a boy with a borrowed power. He was a hero with a council, and they had work to do. The training camp in the forest should have been a welcome reprieve, a chance to focus solely on pushing his quirk to new limits under the boisterous guidance of the wild pussycats. And for a time it was. The grueling physical exertion, the camaraderie with his classmates, the simple joy of mastering full cal at 8%, it was all a grounding force, pulling him firmly into his life as Izuku Midoriya. His new connection to the vestiges had become a quiet, constant presence. It was no longer a terrifying unknown, but a familiar counsel in the back of his mind. He would feel Hikage Shinomori's danger sense as a faint, prickling premonition when Pixie Bob was about to launch a surprise Earth Beast attack. He'd feel a surge of Daigoro Banjo's boisterous energy when he pushed himself to his limits, a phantom voice cheering. "That's it, kid, push it!" Most profoundly, he felt Nana Shimura's quiet, sorrowful strength whenever he saw young Koda, the pussycat's orphan nephew, whose angry grief was a painful echo of what she must feel for her own lost grandson. The memories of Yoichi's life remained locked away, the door to that traumatic vault seemingly closed for now. Izuku was grateful for the respite. He focused on the present, on being a better hero, on being a good friend. He was lulled into a fragile sense of normalcy, a belief that he could control the flow of the past, accessing it only when he chose to. That illusion was shattered in a torrent of blue fire and poison gas. The Vanguard Action Squad's assault on the training camp was a sudden, brutal descent into chaos. One moment, they were on a fun test of courage, the next, the forest was a war zone. The sweet smell of pine was replaced by the acrid stench of smoke and chemicals. The cheerful night sounds were drowned out by screams and explosions. Izuku's mind, honed by his connection to the vestiges, kicked into high gear. This wasn't just a random attack. This was strategic. Coordinated. He felt danger sense flare not as a gentle prickle, but as a screaming klaxon in his skull. The sheer malevolence in the air, the focused, murderous intent, it was a pale imitation, but it carried the same foul texture as his brother's hatred. This was his work, all for one's will, enacted by his new disciples. His mission became singular: protect Koda. The boy was in danger, targeted by the hulking, sadistic villain, Muscular. The ensuing battle was a desperate, bloody affair. Izuku was forced to break himself again, to push past his carefully maintained limits and unleash a 1,000,000% Delaware-Detroit smash. The agony was immense, a familiar, horrifying symphony of shattering bone and tearing muscle. But as he lay broken on the cliffside, his arms ruined, watching Muscular's unconscious form, the physical pain was secondary. A deeper, colder dread was seeping in. He had won, he had saved Koda, but he knew this was just a skirmish in a much larger, older war. Bakugo had been captured. The League had achieved their goal. This knowledge was a lead weight in his gut as he and a small, determined group of his classmates, Todoroki, Kirishima, Momo, and Ida, stood in the crowded plaza of Kamino Ward, disguised in absurdly conspicuous costumes. They were disobeying their teachers, the law, and every rational instinct to mount a desperate, unsanctioned rescue mission. The air buzzed with the nervous energy of the crowd, all eyes fixed on a giant public television screen broadcasting the news. A team of pro-heroes, led by All Might himself, was raiding the League of Villains' suspected hideouts. The nation was holding its collective breath. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and terror. He watched the screen, his gaze locked on the shaky, helicopter-shot footage. He saw Best Jeanist attempting to restrain the villains. He saw the sudden, shocking appearance of All Might. "I am here!" And then, the world stopped. It didn't fade to gray. It didn't tear him away into a memory. It simply froze. From the hideout, amidst the chaos of the raid, a torrent of black, viscous liquid erupted. It wasn't a quirk Izuku recognized. It was a grotesque parody of Kurogiri's warp gate, a foul, sentient sludge that consumed the heroes and villains alike, spitting them out across the ruined cityscape. And from that darkness, a man emerged. He was not the handsome, charismatic specter from Yoichi's memories. This was a different kind of monster. He wore a dark, formal suit, impeccably tailored, and a life support mask of black, industrial tubing that covered the upper half of his face, obscuring where his eyes should be. No nose, no visible features beyond a mouth set in a calm, almost serene line. The top of his head was a mass of scar tissue, a testament to a previous, near-fatal battle. He looked nothing like the man from the sunlit room. But Izuku knew him. Oh God, he knew him. The recognition was not visual. It was primal. It was a chord struck deep within the core of One for All, a fundamental resonance between two opposing forces. The air in Kamino Ward seemed to grow cold. The cheerful chatter of the crowd faded into a dull roar. The man on the screen, a kilometer away, felt as if he were standing right in front of him, his oppressive presence a physical weight on Izuku's soul. It was him. It was his brother. Nana Shimura's presence flared within him, a wave of pure, concentrated hatred and terror. He felt Daigoro's fury, Haikage's cold dread, the grim resolve of the second and third. The Council of Ghosts was screaming in silent unison. "He's here! A voice echoed in his mind, a composite of all of them. The devil is here. On the screen, All for One raised a hand. It's been a while, All Might. His voice. It was the same. Deeper, perhaps, filtered through the mask's vocoder, but the cadence, the calm, arrogant amusement, it was identical. It was the voice that had whispered, "Little brother," in the suffocating darkness of the vault. Izuku felt a wave of nausea so powerful he had to grip Todoroki's shoulder to keep from falling. His friend shot him a worried glance, but Izuku couldn't tear his eyes from the screen. He was paralyzed, a rabbit caught in the gaze of a python. This was no longer a news broadcast. This was a home movie from hell. As the battle began, a cataclysmic confrontation between the two most powerful beings on the planet, Izuku's perception of it fractured. He was seeing it through two sets of eyes, processing it with 2 lifetimes of experience. To Izuku Midoriya, the hero in training, it was a terrifying spectacle of raw power. He watched, horrified, as All for One effortlessly combined a dozen quirks, countering every move All Might made. He saw his mentor, his idol, being pushed back, being brutalized. The analytical part of his brain was frantically trying to catalog the quirks, to understand the strategy, but it was overwhelmed by the sheer, devastating force on display. But to Yoichi Shigaraki, the prisoner returned, it was a sickeningly familiar performance. The terror was still there, but it was layered with a grim, intimate understanding. This was his brother's art form. When All for One casually deflected one of All Might's punches with an invisible force field, Yoichi's memory supplied the context. It wasn't just a defensive quirk. It was a tool of psychological warfare. He remembered his brother demonstrating a similar power centuries ago, stopping a barrage of thrown rocks from a desperate rebel mob. He hadn't just blocked them, he had held them suspended in the air, a testament to his absolute control, before casually turning them back on the crowd. It was a display designed not just to defeat, but to demoralize, to show the utter futility of resistance. "He's showing off," Izuku whispered, the words escaping his lips without his consent. "What?" Kirishima asked, his face pale with fear as he stared at the screen. Izuku couldn't answer. He was lost in the terrible synthesis of past and present. Another memory bled through, not a full sensory experience, but a flash of insight, a fragment of knowledge unlocked by the sight of his brother in action. The scene on the screen, a ruined city block, terrified civilians huddled behind debris, triggered it. He saw his brother, younger, standing in the center of a town that had been ravaged by a flash flood. Buildings were destroyed, families were weeping over lost homes. All for One stood there, his hands outstretched, a picture of benevolent power. He used a combination of quirks to clear rubble, to reinforce damaged structures, to create clean drinking water from the air. The desperate, grateful townspeople flocked to him, hailing him as a savior, a godsend. But Yoichi, watching from the periphery, knew the truth. The memory was saturated with his own sick certainty. The freak storm that had caused the flood hadn't been natural. It was the work of one of his brother's subordinates, a man with a weather manipulation quirk, acting on secret orders. His brother hadn't saved this town. He had broken it, only to then offer it a poisoned salvation. He manufactured despair on a massive scale, then presented himself as the sole source of hope, gathering followers and cementing his power not through conquest, but through carefully orchestrated gratitude. That's how he built his empire, Izuku realized with a jolt of cold horror. It wasn't just by stealing quirks and crushing his enemies. It was by being the devil you prayed to for help. He created the disaster, and then sold the cure. On the screen, All for One was taunting a struggling All Might, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "You've gotten weaker, All Might. This form you cling to is so pathetic." He then turned his attention to the camera, to the world. "But do not fear, citizens. For true peace and order will soon be restored." It was the same speech. The same messianic complex, the same promise of order born from chaos he had created. He wasn't just fighting All Might. He was putting on a show for the entire world, just as he had for that little town centuries ago. The battle raged. Bakugo was rescued by the quick thinking of Kirishima and the others, but Izuku barely registered their escape. He was rooted to the spot, his mind a whirlwind of past and present horrors. Then came the moment that shattered him. All for One, seeing that All Might was still fighting, still resisting, changed tactics. He gestured towards a cowering civilian nearby. "Let's see how you handle this, symbol of peace." Before he could act, Gran Torino shot across the battlefield and knocked the man out. But the intent was clear. All for One was perfectly willing to kill an innocent person, not as a strategic move, but as a simple, cruel jab to distract and wound his opponent emotionally. Another memory, sharper and more painful this time, lanced through Izuku's mind. It wasn't a town or a battle. It was a simple, quiet scene. Yoichi was in his room, a slightly more comfortable version of the vault from a time when he had been more compliant. A young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile was there with him. She was a nurse, one of the few staff members in his brother's compound who showed him genuine compassion. She would sneak him extra books, talk to him about the outside world, treat him like a person instead of a possession. Her name was Anya. She was his only friend. A secret friend. The memory was of their last meeting. They were talking in hushed tones when the door slid open. His brother stood there, his charming smile firmly in place. He had found out. He didn't rage. He didn't shout. He simply looked at Anya with a look of mild disappointment, as one might look at a crack in a favorite teacup. "Anya," he said, his voice soft. "I believe your services are no longer required." He then turned his gaze to Yoichi, and the smile never faltered. "You see, little brother? Attachments like this, they make you weak. They make you vulnerable. I can't allow that." He raised a hand, and before Yoichi could scream, before he could beg, Anya simply ceased to be. There were no tendrils, no flash of light. One moment she was there, her eyes wide with terror, and the next, there was only empty space. A quirk that erased matter? Displaced it to another dimension? Yoichi never knew. The effect was absolute. She was gone. Deleted from existence as easily as erasing a word from a page. All for One had looked at his brother, his eyes holding no malice, only a clinical, corrective certainty. "Now you are safe again," he'd said, as if he had just tidied a messy room. The memory was so vivid, so devastating, that Izuku let out a choked, guttural cry in the middle of the Kamino Plaza. His legs gave out. He would have collapsed onto the pavement if Todoroki and Ida hadn't caught him, holding him up by his arms. "Midoriya! What's wrong?" Ida yelled, his voice frantic. Izuku couldn't answer. Tears were streaming down his face. The casual, thoughtless murder of Anya, an act of supreme possessiveness and personal cruelty, was superimposed over the image of All for One threatening the civilian on screen. He didn't just eliminate strategic threats to his empire. He systematically, meticulously, and sadistically pruned every branch of his brother's life, ensuring that Yoichi was completely and utterly isolated, dependent only on him. His goal wasn't just control. It was absolute ownership of his brother's heart and soul. On the screen, the final act was playing out. All Might, battered and broken, had reverted completely to his skeletal form in front of the entire world. The symbol of peace was revealed to be a fragile, wounded man. All for One laughed. A real, genuine laugh of triumph. "This is your true form. How pitiful! And to think you inherited that power from that pathetic woman, Nana Shimura." He paused, letting the name hang in the air, a deliberate, poisoned dart. "Speaking of which, did you know her grandson, Tenko Shimura? I believe he is now called Tamura Shigaraki." The revelation struck the world like a thunderclap. For Izuku, it was a confirmation of a truth Nana's spirit had been screaming in his soul. He felt her agony, a wave of grief so profound it almost knocked him unconscious. Her legacy, her bloodline, had been corrupted and turned into a weapon by the very monster she died fighting. It was the ultimate act of psychological warfare. His brother hadn't just killed his enemies, he desecrated their memory, he twisted their love into hatred, he salted the very earth of their legacies. All Might, fueled by the last embers of One for All and a righteous fury, gathered his strength for one final, impossible punch. The United States of Smash. Izuku watched, his vision blurred by tears, his mind a maelstrom of 2 lifetimes of horror. He wasn't just a fan watching his mentor fight for the world. He was a prisoner watching his jailer, his brother's murderer, his tormentor, finally get his due. The desperate hope of Izuku Midoriya and the vengeful, grieving rage of Yoichi Shigaraki merged into a single, silent prayer. Finish it. For Nana. For Kaito. For Anya. For all of us. The blow landed. The shockwave tore through the city. And all for one, the devil he knew so intimately, was finally, definitively defeated. As the dust settled and the crowd erupted into a roar of disbelief and relief, Izuku finally collapsed. The strength that had held him upright vanished. He sagged into the arms of his friends, his body trembling violently, his mind a shattered wreck. The psychic feedback from witnessing his ancient enemy in the flesh, combined with the flood of devastating memories, had pushed him far beyond his breaking point. He was vaguely aware of his friends' worried voices, of Kirishima shouting his name. But it was all distant noise. His reality had narrowed to the storm inside his own head. He now understood the true shape of his enemy. All for One was not just a symbol of evil who wanted power. He was a deeply personal monster, a master of psychological torture who built his empire on manufactured hope and absolute terror. He was a collector of people, a gardener who pruned away any affection that didn't lead back to him. He was a brother whose love was the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal. Lying there, supported by his friends in the wreckage of his mentor's career, Izuku felt a change within himself. The boy who had been afraid of the whispers and the static was gone. The student who had worried about burdening his master was gone. In their place, something harder, colder, and infinitely more resolute was beginning to form. The fight against the League of Villains, against Tamura Shigaraki, was no longer just a hero's duty to stop a villain. It was now a deeply personal vendetta. It was a promise to the ghost of a murdered nurse, to the ghost of a kind friend with white hair, and to the grieving ghost of Nana Shimura. It was a promise to the prisoner inside him, the boy named Yoichi. This time, he would not be helpless. This time, he would be the one to protect everyone. And he would make his brother pay for the sins of 2 lifetimes.